Hello everyone, thank you very much for coming, joining us, and also thank you to Gemma for helping organise this, and to Bill for offering to run this webinar. It's really good that people have taken the time and trouble to join us this evening. Bill Froggatt has spoken to us before, and I know that we've all found his talks to be very interesting. So I'll hand you over to Bill.
Okay, thank you. So last autumn, I gave a talk at Lancaster University, and I took the opportunity to go down to the National Archives in Kew, something I'd been wanting to do for some time, to do some research for that talk. And I'm going to share with you now some of the things that I found down in the archives, really focusing on sort of three different areas, which you can maybe see on the screen there. Something about the routes, or the route, sorry, shouldn't be a plural. Something about some of the people that were involved in building the canal, and then something about the structures that they built. As Wendy says, I've spoken to some of you before. I don't know if you're all from the Cumbria and Lancashire area, so I put this slide in just to orientate us all to start off with. And if I just might point out a few things. So clearly the Lancaster Canal originally stretched from Kendal down to, well, it would have reached West Orton, never quite managed it. There was a gap in the middle here where we had a tram line. If I could just point out a few places where I might mention later on in the talk, we've obviously got Kendal here, and then Hincaster, where you'll see a slide of. Chewitfield is around about here, and then it goes through Lancaster. We have the Glasson branch there to Glasson Dock, and then we have Garstang, comes down to Preston, and then, as I mentioned, we had a tram line between Preston and Walton Summit, and then the canal past Johnson's Hillock Flight of Locks, down past Chorley to Wigan. Well, obviously this south end, as it became known, is now part of the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, but originally it was built by the Lancaster Canal. So just let's talk about the route for a little while. They started talking about building this canal in the 1760s, and essentially it was the merchants of Lancaster and Kendal primarily who wanted access to coal. There's a lot of coal around West Orton, and that was their primary reason for building the canal. So that was the 1760s, but it took them 30 years to agree on the route, which I find quite puzzling, really, because I mean, if we go back to the map, really all they had to do was draw a straight line between Kendal, Lancaster, Preston and West Orton, but it took them 30 years to draw that straight line. So the first survey was done in 1771 by a chap called Robert Whitworth, and he was an engineer, and he was James Brindley's lieutenant. He worked with James Brindley, probably the most eminent canal engineer at the time, and the chap who built the Bridgewater Canal. So he did the first survey, and then 15 years later, a chap called John Longbottom did another survey. I think probably what he did actually was review Robert Whitworth's survey. And John Longbottom was more famous for being the Leeds and Liverpool Canal engineer. He identified the route for the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, and he was initially, for the first few years, the engineer who started building the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. And then finally, John Rennie, who a very eminent civil engineer, was the person who zeroed in on what became the parliamentary line. And I've mentioned, if some of you have heard me talking previously, you'll know that in around about 1790, the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, which had been built by that, they were building it for 20 years by that time, decided to change the route. And there was a little, shall we say, a bit of jiggery-pokery, a lot of competition between the Lancaster Canal and the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, because they wanted to occupy the same space, basically. And that's really what prompted the Lancaster Canal to get their act in order. So John Rennie did his survey, and the following year they obtained their Act of Parliament to make a navigable canal from Kirby Kendall to West Orton through Lancaster. They were going to create a branch at Wharton to access I think, is it slate or limestone? I'm not sure, possibly limestone there. And also another branch down at Duxbury, which is just south of Chorley. Those two branches obviously were never built. So let's just have a quick look at those routes, the three routes, shall we say, Robert Whitworth, John Longbottom and John Rennie. Let's just have a quick look at those in a bit more detail. So what we're looking at now is a copy of John Rennie's route, and this red line running through the centre of the map is what became the parliamentary line. So that is the line that was enshrined in law. North is to the left, and if you note, so this is specifically looking at Hincaster, which is in the northern reaches of the canal, one of my favourite locations. So I'm always talking about Hincaster. If you look carefully, you'll see, if you know the area, you'll know that the canal actually goes past Stainton now, today, where the first furlong is, where that's been restored. But if you notice here, the route that John Rennie identified doesn't go through Stainton. Stainton's up here, look. The route that John Rennie identified went due south through Hincaster and then continued south. These numbers represent the landowners who they would have to engage with to buy the land. And if I might just show you this, this shows the landowners in the parish of Hincaster. So you'll see we've got the parish boundary here with that dotted line with the arrow on the top. So this parish, Hincaster parish, goes from here up to this dotted line, and these numbers correspond with the owners here. So the land parcels 1 and 2 belong to a chap called Bordley, by the looks of it, from Kendall. And then number 3 represents the garden of James Benson. And then we have quite a long stretch, number 4, which is 2,350 yards long, which is underneath Hincaster Green. So I imagine that's commonly owned land, and so on and so forth. But you'll notice that there is a tunnel there. So there was always supposed to be a tunnel at Hincaster, but judging by the length of this one, it looks like it is most of parcel 4 plus parcel 5 and parcel 6, which means that that tunnel, as proposed by John Rennie, would have been around about 2,800 yards long, which is a considerable distance. And then going down further south, we've got a couple of locks, and then we end at Hincaster Parish and continue past a place that John Rennie has called Debit Bridge. So if we just have a quick look at that on a more recent map. So north is to the top on this map. We have the canal as built comes in to the north of Hincaster. It would have continued underneath Hincaster Green, which is just here. You'll see this building here is called Green End, and then it would have continued south. There would have been, I think, a couple of locks in around about this area, and then it leaves Hincaster Parish just here. That's the parish line, and then continues on to what John Rennie called Debit Bridge, but I think now we call it Deep Thwaite Bridge, as it's described just here. So if you know the area, you will know that that section as proposed by John Rennie wasn't built, and the canal was actually built over here towards the east. It went through Lancaster Tunnel, a bit further north, through Stainton, and then came down through Crooklands towards Farleton. So that section was built so about 30 years after John Rennie did his route by a different engineer called Thomas Fletcher. Now, I suspect that this route here that was built is actually the route that Robert Whitworth identified 20 years before John Rennie. And my Exhibit A, shall we say, this is an excerpt from Robert Whitworth's survey, and he's describing his survey in words rather than a map here. And you'll notice that he describes an aqueduct over Farleton Brook. Well, we know that the canal as built does go through Farleton or past Farleton. He then describes banking and an aqueduct over Millhouses Brook. And I suspect Millhouses here is actually Millness, as we call it today. And then he describes a cutting at Crooklands. And then he describes banking, etc. at Stanton Brook, which would be Stainton. And then he talks about a tunnel which is 370 yards long. And that is more or less the length of the tunnel that we have today. So I suspect John Rennie devised this route, but Robert Whitworth previously, 20 years before, had devised the route to the east. And when they came to build it, they actually built John Whitworth's route rather than John Rennie's route. Let's just say a little bit about John Longbottom's survey, which was in 1786. And we're looking at a very similar area. So Hincaster is just off the screen to the bottom here. So the canal comes down from Kendal through Sedgwick down to Hincaster, and it comes back up north past Sellet Hall. This is the first furlong here that the Lancaster Canal Trust are currently restoring, and then past Stainton Aqueduct and down here. Now, this will be, I think this has been particularly interesting to those of us who would like to see the canal restored. And we are quite aware that there are some significant barriers, some significant physical barriers, not least of all the dual carriageway, the A590, I think it is, which cuts the canal in two places. Well, you might be interested to know that when John Longbottom did his survey, he came up with a different route in this area. He says in his description that he fortunately bumped into a farmer when he was coming down the route, and the farmer pointed out a different route for him. And if I might just do that, he described a route from NAT Land Valley, which is over where Sedgwick is, via Rains Hall, Cross Creek House, and Kellet or Sallet Hall. Now, I don't know precisely where that is, but if you look on the map, you'll see Rains Hall just here. And then you'll see Cross Creek, which must have been his Cross Creek house. And then you'll see Sellet Hall down here. And if I might just draw that on the map, this is the route, this is the alternative route that John Longbottom suggested. And if you know the area, Rains Hall is where they have the maze every year in this field. So an alternative route that John Longbottom suggested back in the day, and actually thinking about it today, if we were to create, if we're going to restore the canal and follow that route, there'd be a lot fewer physical barriers. We wouldn't have to cross the dual carriageway in two particular locations. We would have to cross the West Coast Main Line, but not the dual carriageway. So something to bear in mind. I know, Robin, that you're on the call, so you bear that in mind for future restorations. So one of the reasons why I am passionate about maintaining historic structures, canals and buildings and bridges and so on and so forth, is that they were built by people, and generally speaking, they're built by people who history have forgotten. And I personally think that it's worth preserving the fruits of their labour. And history hasn't forgotten that the engineer responsible for the Lancaster Canal was John Rennie. And John Rennie is one of our most eminent civil engineers. He's buried in St Paul's Cathedral, and I think that says it all, really. And if you want to know more about John Rennie, you can look up in a book, you can look up on Wikipedia, and you can find out about him. But John Rennie was not solely responsible for building this canal, and in fact, he spent most of his time not at the canal, and it was actually built by other people. And I'd just like to share some of those names with you. Underneath John Rennie were two resident engineers who were on the ground, and they were here all the time, and they organised the contractors. And they were, certainly at the start, they were called Archibald Miller, another Scot, and Henry Eastburn, a chap from York. He was the brother-in-law of John Smeaton, another engineer who is known for his lighthouses in particular. He was from Leeds. And so Archibald Miller was responsible for the canal from Chewetfield down to just below Garstang, and Henry Eastburn built the section from Garstang down to Wigan to Bark Hill. Prior to working on the Lancaster, Archibald Miller had been on the Forth and Clyde Canal, and he worked with a chap called John Pinkerton. John Pinkerton was the main contractor on his section. You'll see his name lower down here. I'll talk a little bit about John Pinkerton a bit further on, but John Pinkerton was quite a difficult character. And I think, judging by letters, I think Archibald Miller didn't really, well, they didn't get on, shall we say. John Pinkerton, let's jump ahead, John Pinkerton. The Pinkertons were 2 or 3 generations of not civil engineers, but they were contractors. They did a lot of digging and shifting soil. And they were, if you like, the first national civil engineering contractors that this country produced. And they built a lot of canals around the country. In particular, let's have a look. They built the Basingstoke Canal and Driffield Navigation, the Birmingham Canal, and they were renowned for having their contracts terminated. And Archibald Miller found it very difficult to get John Pinkerton to do what he wanted him to do, in particular the puddling. And as a consequence, Pinkerton's contract was terminated early on the Lancaster Canal. But I've got ahead of myself slightly. So Archibald Miller and Henry Eastburn were the resident engineers on the canal at the start. They were supported by a chap called William Cartwright, and Cartwright had supported Henry Eastburn on the Basingstoke Canal. They'd both worked down there. And William Cartwright was taken on as an assistant, and he had particular responsibility for the foundations of the Lune Aqueduct, and he was thought very highly of. Samuel Gregson, who I'll mention a bit later, wrote of him, "He's like a flea on a hot girdle," meaning griddle, of course, not girdle, but just emphasising how much energy William Cartwright put into his work. When Archibald Miller and Henry Eastburn left, in around about 1799, William Cartwright became the sole resident engineer on the canal, and he was responsible for building the tram line between Preston and Walton Summit. And he died at a very young age. He died at 39, and his obituary in the newspaper wrote of him, William Cartwright was only in his 39th year, though his appearance was that of a much older man. And I think we can take from that he probably died of overwork. He worked very hard. And the obituary goes on to say, his abilities and his judgment were equally mature. He possessed a happy cheerfulness of temper, which gained him the esteem of all who had the pleasure of knowing him, and which made the workmen employed under him execute his commands with a promptitude that few could excite. So the next engineer we should talk about is Thomas Fletcher, and he joined initially as an assistant to Henry Eastburn, and then he left and he built, amongst other things, the Union Bridge in Aberdeen. There's a picture of it there, and then he returned he returned to build the canal from Chewickfield north up to Kendal. And he was assisted by a chap called William Crossley, who'd previously been the engineer on the Rochdale Canal. And Thomas Fletcher built the canal largely from Chewickfield up to Hincaster, and then William Crossley took over and continued from Hincaster up to Kendal, and then he later built the Glasson branch. Let's mention Alexander Stevens. So Alexander Stevens is another Scottish gentleman, and he was a builder. He made his name building bridges in Scotland and Ireland, and he was the contractor who built the Lune Aqueduct. Let me just read another quote from one of the letters that I read. That Samuel Gregson wrote: "The old gentleman had the misfortune to be run down by a cow in the street, which had broke loose from the butcher's. He was considerably bruised, but he's getting better very fast." Now, he referred to him as the old gentleman to differentiate him from the young man, Alexander Stevens, i.e. Alexander Stevens' son, because the Lune Aqueduct was built by Alexander Stevens and Alexander Stevens, father and son. And unfortunately, Stevens Senior died before the completion of the Lune Aqueduct, and is buried in Lancaster Parish Church. So we've talked a little bit about John Pinkerton and the difficult relationship he had with Archibald Miller, and the letters are absolutely, there are so many letters in the records of complaints about John Pinkerton and his refusal to do what he was asked to do. And in fact, John Gregson wrote in a quite understated way, "I am quite tired with writing about them." And in the end, their contract was terminated. And possibly they were given too much to do. They were contracted to build everything from Chewickfield down to just below Garstang, except the Lune Aqueduct. So that was all the cutting, all the bridges, and possibly it was too much for them, really. Oh, I forgot to mention, let's go back, William Crossley, when he left in 1826, and he eventually jumped ship and became a railway engineer, and he built, he worked on the London and Birmingham Railway, and he built, amongst other things, the Tring cutting underneath Robert Stevenson, and there is a picture of the Tring cutting. And you might imagine he put what he learned from cutting canals into good use by cutting that rather large cutting. Some other people, some smaller names, Paul Vickers and John Lewis, they cut the canal down from Chorley down to Wigan. William Ross, he built a few aqueducts, and I've underlined Lostock Brook because those of you who walked on the abandoned canal from Johnson's Hillock with me will remember walking underneath the motorway, and immediately after the motorway was an aqueduct that we climbed up, and that was Lostock Aqueduct, built by William Ross, another Scot. And then we have, let's go down to Law and Richards, and these two manned the steam engines at the Lune Aqueduct, and they both got the sack. They both did not manage the engine in a proper manner and burnt upwards of 3,600 weight of coals per day. So they got the sack. But I suspect there was another reason why they got the sack, because occasionally Samuel Gregson refers to Mr. Richards as being very much in liquor. 3 months before they got the sack, Samuel Gregson wrote of Richards, "The new engine man has made a little free with the bottle since he came, but he promises not to do so again." So I suspect they got rid of him because he liked a drink or two. And then finally, but most importantly, Samuel Gregson. Samuel Gregson was the man, the single most important man on the canal, sort of person, sorry. He was made the official clerk for the company in June 1791, and he continued in that position until his death in 1846 at the age of 84. And effectively, we would call him today the project director. He made sure all the land was bought. He made sure the Acts of Parliament were achieved. He directed the engineers around. He ordered building materials. He told people off when they weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing. And then I should mention also his son, Brian Paget Gregson, who started working with his father in 1813. And he also dedicated his life to the canal. And he became engineer after William Crossley left in 1826. He developed the flyboat service, and he defended the canal against the railways. And when he died in 1872, he'd dedicated 60 years of his life to the canal. So really, Samuel Gregson and his son, Brian Paget Gregson, were Mr. Lancaster Canal and Son, basically. So there's some names of people who we can thank for our canal. There's, as you can see, more than just John Rennie responsible for the canal that we enjoy today. So having spoken about some people, I'd just like to talk about some of the things that they made, and start with, well, the bulk aqueduct. Clearly, they didn't make bulk aqueduct, but there is a nice story behind the aqueduct. I mean, on the canal as a whole, there are about 24 aqueducts, the chief one being the Loon Aqueduct. But the bulk aqueduct on Caton Road, north out of Lancaster, was replaced in the 1960s. And here are the drawings for that. And essentially, they did it because they needed a better access up to the Lancaster bypass as it was then, the M6 as we know it now. This is the highways, the county council's drawings for the new aqueduct to be built then. If I just add some colour, you can see the original aqueduct with the portal there and the canal going over the top, and then the new aqueduct that we see today, about half the width and probably twice the length. I can maybe just show you this as well. The canal was kept open whilst the aqueduct was rebuilt by a trestle. The boats were taken out of the canal and hauled along the trestle and put back in the canal at the other side. And also there was a water pipe along here so that the water can get from one side to the other. And you can see, not a very good photograph, but you can see a boat on that trestle being taken along from one side to the other. So the original aqueduct looked like this. And perhaps if you know that road, you'll know that it's a busy road, and you can see that actually that really wasn't wide enough for the traffic we have today. And here is John Rennie's original drawing for that, what he's called a bridge at bulk. He's signed it here. You can see John Pinkerton has signed it as well. And John Pinkerton agreed to build this at a cost of £892. Let me just point out as well, you'll see that the road level has been reduced. So they lowered the turnpike in order to build it. In 1794, so 2 years later, Samuel Gregson wrote to John Rennie, and he said, the flat cap on the top of the pilaster at the bulk aqueduct, just here, will not have a good appearance. Could you not design something that will look more like a finished piece? The work looks well, and a little finish here would add to its beauty. And John Rennie responded with these alternatives. An obelisk or a ball, looks like a boat with bow waves and an obelisk and an urn, and possibly that's a pineapple or an acorn. Or option 6 was just leave it as it was, which obviously was the cheapest option and the option that the committee agreed on. Or did they? This is what it looked like. Maybe they just accepted, well, we'll just put that a little bit of stone on the top, it'll be cheaper and it'll look a little bit nicer. But as we know, it's not there anymore. And this picture here, a heartbreaking picture of it being taken down in around about 1960. And as I said the last time I did this talk, if you didn't know that was 1960, you would at least know that it was pre-1974, the year of the Health and Safety at Work Act, because there are I mean, that's a perfect picture for someone teaching health and safety at work. These people here are all stood on the item that they're demolishing. They're just chiseling off stone into that bucket. There's a bloke sat underneath it with no hard hat or any protection whatsoever. There's a small boy walking around the building site. How times have changed in the last 50 years. But a nice picture. You can see the trestle behind with the water pipe beneath it. But by the same token, a heartbreaking picture. We'll very briefly talk about the Lune Aqueduct, because we've talked about it all before. But essentially, they built these piers were built in caissons. They pile drived caissons in the river, pumped out the water using steam engines, and then built the piers within the caisson, and then built the aqueduct on those piers. And if I just might mention another letter from Gregson to Rennie, he mentioned 1794. He was talking about the engines that they were using. Balancing the beam of the large engine has made her go very smoothly. Joseph Purcell, who is the new engine man, behaves very soberly. Clearly is not drinking like the old guy that they had to sack for his drinking. Now, allegedly, it is the cost of the Lune Aqueduct which meant that they couldn't afford to build the Ribble Aqueduct, and consequently the north and south sections were not joined together. And that's quite possible, because the Lune Aqueduct was estimated to cost £18,000 to build, and it actually cost £48,000, so more than twice the cost. This is a picture of what the Ribble Aqueduct would have looked like had they built it. So very similar, but the arches are elliptical rather than semicircular like at the Lune, and I think that has allowed for fewer piers in the river. But as you well know, they didn't build it. And what they did build instead was something far less grand, a rickety old timber construction, a temporary solution which lasted for 60 years. And this is the Tram Bridge, which goes, you can see the tracks on the incline up to Avonham Park in Preston. And this was, as I say, supposed to be a temporary solution which lasted for 60 years. But it's not just the cost, of course, of that aqueduct. They would also have to pay for the construction of, I think it is 27 locks to take the canal from the Ribble aqueduct up to what we now know as Walton Summit. And the cost of those would have been equally expensive. And I think that's why we never saw the North and South Canal joined together. So let's just have a look at a few more pictures that I found in the archives. So I'm not going to say too much about locks, because the Lancaster Canal is not really known for its locks. John Rennie identified 36 locks on his parliamentary route, and not one single one of those locks was built, primarily because those 27 weren't built. But in the end, I think there's 7 locks at Johnson's Hillock, 8 at Tuitfield, and then later 7 on the Glasson branch. And those at Tuitfield and Johnson's Hillock were built by Thomas Fletcher, and those on the Glasson branch were built by William Crossley. So really, the Lancaster Canal is known for not having locks, and it was that absence of locks which made it perfect for the flyboat service. And here is a flyboat, and I think this one, yes, this was drawn by William Cartwright in 1797. If I just might show you that. That shows you what the flyboat looked like in 1797. It had a fore cabin and a cabin to the aft, and then a central section, possibly where the packets were kept. There is a letter published in, where's my letter gone? I've lost my letter. I shall just read you. I've got some notes of it here, but there was a letter that Samuel Gregson wrote to a chap called John Moss, who was the master of the Loon packet boat. And in the letter, he identified the rules of being the master of the packet boat. And one of them was that you weren't allowed to sell wine or spirituous liquors, but you weren't prohibited from selling malt liquor. So you could sell beer, but you couldn't sell wine or anything stronger. You had to provide tea and coffee. You had to keep the windows in good repair. You weren't allowed to let anyone stay on the boat when you arrived at your destination. And to get from Kendal to Lancaster would cost 3 shillings in the fore cabin, 2 shillings in the aft cabin. I don't know if you got a better ride in the fore cabin. But there's an interesting publication called Jots and Tittles by a Wandering Trio, dating from 1846, about a journey on this packet boat from Preston to Kendal. I won't read it all because we haven't got time, but let me just read a small excerpt. At occasional bridges, the passage boat is drawn towards the side and some passengers quickly leap to shore and stumble against the expectant attendants. His luggage is clumsily ejected after its owner. The postilion cracks his whip, the rope tightens and leaps from the water with a shower of drops, and we're off again. I think that really conjures up a nice image of what it would have been like on the passenger, on the flyboat. So I now have 4 minutes left, so I need to rush through a few slides. Let me just say, I may have said to you before that this is Lancaster Tunnel made of limestone, but on the inside it's bricks. And I found this letter which explains why they used bricks on the inside of the tunnel. And it's as such as this letter was sent to Benjamin Bevan, who was the engineer on the Grand Junction Canal. And Samuel Gregson wrote, "In this part of the county, we are little accustomed to brickwork, our quarries being generally freestone. But in the part of the county where the tunnel is situated, we have nothing but limestone." And effectively that explains why they use bricks. So freestone is a stone which is easily carved. So soft limestone or sandstone. But the limestone in this area is very, very hard. And the people repairing Stainton Aqueduct, which is made of the same stuff, have come across the same problems, that the limestone is so hard that it's blunted their tools. And that is why Lancaster Tunnel was built with bricks on the inside, limestone on the outside. We recently unveiled a red wheel, a Transport Trust red wheel here. And this is, we have Peter Stone on the left-hand side, who's a trustee of the Transport Trust. And on the right, we have Rob Shawland Ball, who's vice chair of the Transport Trust. And beforehand, we did some essential repairs. This is a repair in progress on that portal. And prior to that, we got some scouts from the local area to come and help clear the vegetation out of the dry canal there. I'm going to skip these slides. Now, let me just show you this one. This is a drawing of the lockkeeper's house at Glasson. This building is still there. You can see it here, almost looking exactly the same. If I just go back again, there it is. Early in the 20th century, it looked like that. Now I think it looks very similar, but it's got a porch built on the front. So I'm not going to talk about buildings because we're a bit pushed for time. But let me just finish off a little bit on bridges, because you'll all be familiar with the bridges on the canal, and they all more or less look like this. So this again is the specification drawn up by John Rennie. This one is signed by Peter Grant and Company, because Peter Grant built some of the bridges. And generally, this is what they look like. But if you know the canal at all, you'll also know that some of them look like this. And they've had their parapets taken off and replaced by these railings. And this happened during the war, 1940, in fact, it happened. And what happened was Western Command, who was responsible for our part of the world, they looked after, they defended Warwickshire and Wales north up to the border with Scotland, they issued an order, Operation Instruction number 7, on the 5th of July 1940. And part of that order was certain command lines along which defensive posts, roadblocks and anti-tank obstacles will be constructed under the direction of area commander concerned, as shown in Appendix A. The object is to extend throughout the vulnerable parts of the command a number of lines in which an enemy advancing with or without tanks and from east or west will find no gaps or weak places whatever, and against which he will be held firm until mobile troops can attack and destroy him. It goes on, in nearly all the cases, the lines will have to be manned by local defence volunteers. And if you look in Appendix A, it references line number 15 from Preston to Lancaster, essential to prevent rupture of the communication of the main road from either east or west. So essentially, the Lancaster Canal was turned into a stop line to protect the communications north and south from an invasion on the Lancaster coast. And to us, maybe we think that that's probably quite highly unlikely to happen. But of course, they had to think of all eventualities at the time. And this is one of the most well-preserved of those wartime bridges. You can see the parapet's been taken off and a large lump of concrete has been put on the end. And then at the opening of the bridge, they've built these tank traps, one of which is built by reinforced concrete and another is built by the masonry which they've taken from the parapet and built that there. And then across the opening of the bridge, you'll see that they put in a concrete sill, and within that they sunk pipelines. You can just see the top of it there. And there was about 5 of those across the opening of the bridge. And they would slot in there a section of telegraph pole to form a barrier. And you'll see also this steel hawser, which is hanging off the bridge. And that would have been dragged over the top of the bridge through, you can see it there, and it would have been dragged across the opening and down the other side and attached to the other side of the bridge like this, also to form a barrier to stop anyone crossing the bridge. And I assume they took the parapets off so that any advancing soldiers couldn't hide behind the parapet. They could be shot and prevented from crossing the bridge. So I mean, I think this is it's a little known part of the history of the canal, and I think this bridge is, you know, really important. Not only is it one of, shall we say, John Rennie's bridges, an eminent civil engineer, but also it's part of our more recent history from the war. So you may have heard. Let me just briefly. My timer is finished. I've gone over 40 minutes as usual, but most of the bridges look like what we've seen. There were a couple which were slightly more fancy, like this one at LL Grange. Now, I don't know if this was paid for by the canal company or if it was paid for by the person who lived at LL Grange. There was another one very similar down at Hague, which was owned by the Earl Balcarres, big landowner down near Wigan. And they designed this bridge for him. And it was actually, although it doesn't exist anymore, it was built. You can see a picture of it here, that it didn't appear to put the obelisks on. They did build the rest of it. So it does appear that if you're a landowner, you could have a much nicer bridge built on your land and not just the run-of-the-mill ones which occurred everywhere else. So that is all I want to say today. If anyone's got any questions, it's been a bit of a rush through. But hopefully you found it interesting, and if anyone wants to ask any questions, if you direct them through the chat to Wendy, and Wendy will ask them and ask them.
If anyone's got any questions, it's just in the Q&A box. I've been looking at it and no one's asked any questions yet. So I've got one or two for you, Bill. Well, before I start the questions, I'll say thank you very much for that really interesting talk. I know quite a lot about the Lancaster Canal, but there's always so much more to learn, and I'm amazed at how many directions that learning could go in.
Yeah.
But for example, what you've just talked about, the Second World War. I think someone's told me about that in the past, but I know very little about it, and it would be so interesting to pursue it. And also the characters that you've mentioned, it's always interesting to know about them because they quite often get left out of the history books. And the fact that the landowners with lots of money were able to get nice bridges, well, nothing's really changed, has it?
No, no.
So my question is, you're obviously very interested in what you do. It's not just a job; it's a passion. So I was wondering how you first became interested in Canal Heritage.
Let me just say, Gemma, I can't start my video. I think you might have to start it for me. I mean, my interest in history and buildings in general goes back to when I was a child, and my mother was always very interested in history, and we spent a lot of time visiting old buildings, generally, you know, big buildings, manor houses and so on and so forth. And then I became interested in carpentry, and I was a carpenter for a short period of time. And I worked at Lincoln Cathedral as a carpenter on the roof there. And I've always believed that a building like Lincoln Cathedral and our own canal and the Bingley Five Rise and all our bridges really are testaments to the people that built them. And history, as I said beforehand, really has forgotten those people. But it's their skills that we now celebrate, even though we've forgotten who they are. So I spent a bit of time as a carpenter on Lincoln Cathedral. As I started getting a bit older, and I found that lifting the tools around was becoming a bit difficult, I thought I'd like to pursue the same sort of career, but from the comfort of a chair. So I did a degree at the University of Birmingham about maintaining the historic building environment. And then, as it happens, part of the coursework on that university course required me to do a conservation management plan. And someone told me that I should phone up someone at the Canal and River Trust because they might like to have one done on one of their structures. So I did that. And a few years later, they phoned me up and said, there's a vacancy at the canals. Would you like to come and work with us just to cover maternity leave for 9 months or however long it was? And I did that and had my temporary contract extended or made permanent, basically. And that was 6 years ago. And like I say, my main job is about helping to preserve those buildings, but the history for me is equally important. And really, we're maintaining those buildings because of the history and because of the people that made them, and and because of the people that use the canal afterwards.
And we're very lucky to have you in this area. I've got a couple of questions that have come up. One from David Faulkner, who is our one of our committee members on the Lancashire and Cumbria branch, and he's asking, at Hincaster, how were they able to diverge from the Rennie route if the Rennie route was enshrined in the Act of Parliament?
Parliament, yeah. So the Act of Parliament that they got enabled them to deviate the canal within a certain distance from the parliamentary line, and they did that quite frequently up and down the canal. If they wanted to do a bigger deviation, as they did around Garstang, because that wasn't John Rennie's route either, they had to get a new act, as far as I'm aware. And I don't know that they had to get a new act to go back to Robert Whitworth's route, but I suppose that they probably did. So in short, the answer is that they were able to make small deviations under their initial Act of Parliament. If they wanted to make bigger ones, then they had to go back and get a new Act of Parliament, unless they had full agreement with the landowners, and in which case they could just go and do it.
Okay. And another question, is John Rennie the engineer for Ulverston Canal? And also a supplementary question, which I was going to ask you as well, is Gregson related to the Gregson Centre in Lancaster? And that's from Stephen Povey.
Okay, yes, okay. And I see that there's a question from Philip Garside in the chat as well. But so I don't know actually if Rennie was engineer for Ulverston Canal, but I do know that the contractor for the Ulverston Canal was our friend John Pinkerton. And he was doing that at the same time that he was working on the Lancaster Canal. And I suspect that's one of the reasons why he wasn't able to devote as much time as he should have done on the Lancaster Canal. But I don't know if Rennie was engineer on the Ulverston. I've not seen that he was. And he spent, well, most of the time he spent in London at this time anyway. So whether he was or not, I don't know. So there was a supplementary to that, was there?
The Gregson Centre in Lancaster.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. So Samuel Gregson was from Lancaster, and his eldest son, also called Samuel Gregson, was MP for Lancaster, and I think also was one of the founders of possibly the Natural History Museum in London, one of the big museums. So the Gregsons were a bit, you know, a very important family in Lancaster. I believe that Brian Paget Gregson was the Lord Lieutenant of Lancaster, and so I would be very, very, very surprised if the Gregson Centre in Lancaster was not named after that family, or one of the Samuels or Brian.
Okay. And then the question that Phil Garside is asking, okay, where exactly was the Warm modified bridge?
So all of the bridges from around about Garstang up to LL and then along the Glasson branch have been modified to a great to the same extent. The one which is best preserved, which we were looking at the pictures of, is Corliss Bridge, and that is 2 bridges further north than Ratcliffe Wharf, if you know where that is. Ratcliffe Wharf. Does anyone know? I'm not entirely sure where Ratcliffe Wharf is. I think it's north of Garstang. If anyone on the call can put something in chat to help us.
Well, so far no one has, but
okay.
we've got.
Sorry, it's should we say it's halfway between Garstang and LL? But if you can find Ratcliffe Wharf, I think it's Bridge 76, Corliss Bridge, something like that.
Okay. So we've no more questions, Bill.
Sorry.
But we've got a lot of comments which are saying how interesting the talk was, and thank you very much. And also comments saying that from people who can't normally get to our social meetings because of the distance, saying how happy they are with this this kind of talk. So thank you very much, Bill. That was really interesting, and like I said before, there's always something more to learn.
Yeah, okay. Just worth saying as well that Graham Russell has pointed out that John Rennie was the engineer for Ulverston Canal.
Okay.
Thank you, Graham.
You can see something that I can't see or haven't had a chance to look at.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's a pleasure to come and talk to you. It's a shame we can't all be in the same room, but thanks. We're still able to do this, which is great.
It is, but normal service will resume, hopefully, before too much longer. Yeah. So thank you for talking to us, Bill. It's always really interesting to listen to you. And we've got you on our programme for the next year, the September 20 to April 21 year. So we'll be able to hear you again.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say to people that we did have quite a few events planned for this summer, but unfortunately they're not taking place. Some of them were time critical, so we won't be able to do them. For example, Country Fest, that's been cancelled. Hopefully we'll be there next year. But some of them we might be able to run later on in the year. In particular, we'd organised some walks. And the walk that you led, Bill, were around the old part of the Lancaster Canal at Wealton. We're hoping to run that walk again later on in the year, hopefully as part of the Heritage Open Days. So what I would say to people is keep an eye on the website, because we'll be sending out a magazine shortly, but there's always a time lag. So keep an eye on the IWA website to find out what is going on. At the moment, we've all got to stay at home, but as soon as we are allowed to go out, as long as it can be done safely, we will start to look at events again. Towing-path topics, the deadline for contributions is today. So I don't know whether David would accept anything in the next 24 hours or 48 hours. The answer is probably yes. We're not going to print it because of printing and distribution problems because of the virus and the lockdown. What we are going to do is send it out to people by email. So a lot of people in our Lancashire and Cumbria branch have given head office their email addresses. And I'm guessing that a lot of the people who are here today are tech savvy and know what they're doing with emails and have done that. But if there is anybody who hasn't given their email address to IWA head office, now is the opportunity to do so, because then we will be able to send you towing-path topics by email. But don't worry if you can't. We will make arrangements for those people whose email addresses we haven't got, but it will be just so much easier if we can email them to everybody. So in terms of events, one of the things that we did do before the lockdown was organise our programme for September 20 to April 21, and you will be seeing what we've got organised for you in towing-path topics when you eventually get it. Some very interesting speakers, including Bill, and we've also got Paul Rogers, the IWA National Chairman, newly elected. It feels new anyway. He is coming to talk to us in September. So keep an eye on your bulletin for dates on that. And just let me check, because since I said no more questions, I thought I'd got some more, but no, it's comments. So I'd like to say again, thank you very much to Jame for organising this. Thank you very much to Bill for speaking. Thank you to everyone who's turned out to listen, and I hope you've all found it worthwhile. And whatever you get up to this summer, I know it won't be what you've planned to do, but certainly whatever you do get up to, have a good summer, and hopefully we will speak again. And I'm now going to close the meeting. Bye everyone.